everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits and welcome to another episode of Dyepot Weekly. Today I am going to try something that in a recent video I said I didn't think could happen. And I am referring to speckling with fluorescent colors. From a lot of recent videos I've taken advantage of the fact that these fluorescent acid dyes from Dharma Trading Company don't strike very fast, so the colors spread through, which means that they can have really awesome effects. But it means that it doesn't create as sharp speckles like some other colors, even true black and navy and things like that, that we've done in the past. So today we're going to try some countertop speckling techniques with fluorescent dyes to see if we can get some decent speckles or if we end up with massive amounts of bleeding at the end. And I hope we don't do that. Today's video is sponsored by the viewer Shauna Jones. Shauna, thank you so much for sponsoring this episode of Dyepot Weekly. And now, let's go dye our yarn. The three Dharma acid dyes we're going to play with today are Fluorescent Safety Orange, Fluorescent Fuchsia, and Purple Pop. Of the three of these, the Purple Pop will lead to there being some speckles because this color breaks. You end up with a pink spread and a more blue, which then looks purple because of the pink speck in the middle that strikes fast. It does feel almost like the reverse of what Woman's Violet does, and so yeah, we'll combine these three together and see what we end up with. Since we will be dealing with dry powder, I will be wearing a respirator mask and safety glasses and gloves while we're dealing with the powder. And none of the equipment or tools I'm using today are used for food. They're all dedicated for dyeing yarn. Speaking of the yarn, today we are going to dye Knit Pick Stroll. This yarn is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. And so far I've pre-soaked the yarn in plain tap water, but I will sort of dip it into a vinegar solution momentarily. We want acid to be present in the yarn so that way the speckles can strike. Similar to food coloring, acid dyes only work on protein-based fibers. Wool, alpaca, silk, angora, things like that. This dye won't work on cotton or synthetics like acrylic or polyester. I ended up adding 4 tablespoons of white vinegar to our container here. The amount of acid is based on the water volume, not the amount of yarn. There happens to be 400 grams of yarn in here, but that's not why I picked 4 tablespoons. I actually might normally do a little bit less acid, but I want to give these colors a good shot.
We are going to do the speckling in a couple of different ways. One of the ways is we're going to go straight from the powder containers onto the yarn on the countertop. The next way is we're actually going to take just a little bit of dye and mix it in with some citric acid. This could help in 2 ways. One, we are diluting the color so that we can add less dye onto the yarn at once. And the other thing that this does is allow us to introduce a little more acid, since there's the citric acid in here, which can also help with the colors striking. And we want to stir this up thoroughly. We'll see, and we can always add more colors to these later on if we feel like that's necessary. I mean, right now it doesn't look like the Fuchsia has very much pigment in it, but we will see. I am spreading out our skein as much as I can. I do have reusable nylon zip ties on here because it just helps keep things from getting tangled. If you'd like to learn more about any of the yarn, tools, or equipment I'm using, I do have affiliate links in the video description. We want our hands to be dry before we start speckling because we don't want the powder from our containers to like clump or to introduce dampness into them. I have another skein right here. This is I'm going to use to wipe the excess dye off my fingers as a yarn mop over the course of this video. Let's start with some Purple Pop. So I'm going to take up a little pinch and then slowly, some places a little less slowly, but slowly move it and let these colors fall onto the yarn. And you can see those colors starting to come up. And the key is to go really, really light. And you can see just how much pigment was on my fingertips there. And I will wash my hands and dry them off in between colors. So with just the purple pop, we do have tiny speckles right now. They still could spread when we heat set it, but they could remain as speckles. The key for decent countertop speckles is to not pick up too much dye. So if I pick it up, I let some fall back in the container. And then you can see that was a little much. And I am rubbing the fingers together versus even opening them up. I have no idea how different the fuchsia might feel to the purple pop. Sort of waiting for it to pop out. I think they're going to feel similar. I'm being a little bit cautious here because I want to evaluate our ability to speckle with these dyes. And then, yeah, and there is absolutely a difference between the fuchsia and the purple pop in terms of color. But right now on the yarn with these speckles, it feels very subtle. Finally, we've got our safety orange. And this one should feel different. So radioactive does also break a little bit like the violet does, which is interesting, always interesting to me. Because I think it's because there's not like a good fluorescent blue pigment. So for example, when I was doing the rainbows, I used Frozen, which is a nice neon blue tone, but it doesn't react under black light, which occasionally I show in videos. I don't always show that. So I'm paying attention to add color to areas where there might not have been a lot of color before, especially around ties and edges. But the key is less is more, and I'm being very cautious because these colors have the potential to spread out a lot. I mean, there's a lot of pigment just from what was left on my gloves after each of these colors. Right now we've got beautiful speckles. As I flip, some of these might spread a little more, but right here you really can see all three colors.
I flipped the yarn over carefully, trying not to rub it, because if I were to rub it on the counter, that would spread these colors out and cause them to sort of blend a bit more, which wasn't really our goal here. And then I added each of the three colors to the other side, washing my hands in between. I did go ahead and move it a little bit more just to check to see if there were any areas that felt like they needed a bit more color, and added a little more purple pop before finishing up.
Now that I am satisfied with the coverage, it is time to steam set this first colorway. Carefully, I'm picking it up and putting it in a steamer basket. The goal is to not disrupt these speckles if I can help it. But I'm going to now go steam set this for 30 minutes on the stovetop. And as for this dye on the counter, well, that's a job for our yarn mop. And we can wipe this up quite literally, using it as a rag. And this is why I often call it a mop, just because I am mopping up the excess color. And by doing this, we are blending the three colors a bit on this skein. And I also do want to steam set the color here. I'm not sure if this could be done. Yeah, I might call it for this one in a moment, but it's going to need to wait because I want to finish steaming the first skein before I pop this into the steamer basket. Let's start speckling with the citric acid mixtures we made at the beginning. Once again, I'm going to take the skein and I am spreading it out as much as I can. And also, you can see I don't have it very neatly arranged because I want to be able to access some fibers underneath the top layer in areas, and so this helps a bit. And for our yarn mop, I have not pre-soaked, but I did dunk it in the vinegar solution. This is Swish DK. It is 100% superwash merino. And we'll be using it similar to what we did last time, except, actually I probably won't need to be wiping my fingers. I'll probably just go directly between the colors, but I wanted the mop on hand. And I do want my hands to be dry before starting this. So this time I've got the Fluorescent Safety Orange first. And I'm now taking a larger pinch and going in heavier. There's some on my hands, and that's not a big deal. I'm going to now take a big pinch of, I think this is our Fluorescent Fuschia, and I'm going to mix them up, but I'm just doing them individually at first, so that way I can show you the difference, even though we still have citric acid on my hand. And then we'll come over here and do purple pop. So there's many different like mixtures and proportions you can do with these colors, but this allows you to add a greater volume to your yarn without adding too much pigment. And you can see that we are getting spread out speckles. This is the purple pop. It's still sort of going into the fiber, but even where things are heavier, you can see a lot more speckles. And here is our safety orange. Yeah, so this time you still want to let the colors, and this is more purple pop, you still want it to fall slowly. And it's a little, well, it falls a bit faster because it's got the extra weight of that citric acid, I suppose. But you don't want to dump it still, but you can go a lot heavier. But it depends on the proportions that you mix up. And you don't have to do this on the countertop. You could use this low immersion as well. And there you might then see, depending on the water level, you might either get more spread, but yeah, this is just a nice way to prevent you from adding way too much color, which I still might add way too much color. The thing about it that's harder for me is that you can't entirely see where it lands immediately. So you have to think about that as you go. I've noticed there's more mix between the colors as I'm wiping my hands on the yarn mop periodically, mainly because I'm not swapping in between. I don't think it's affecting the colors that are going onto the yarn at all, but it does make a little bit of a difference with what I see on that mop. Yeah, so you can see we've got some blended color versus just the fuchsia, like right there. These speckles are teeny. Again, this is the heavier section that we showed at the beginning. So if these stay, then I mean, this would be awesome. I'm giving a better shot on this working. I'm not sure if you guys remember my Hanukkah Oops colorway from 2018, but I speckled with the dry powder directly, and then when I steamed it, I had added way too much dye and the color spread a ton. So you never quite know what will happen in the steamer basket. But now let's speckle the rest of this.
I went heavy with these speckles. I think still overall less pigment is probably going on this skein than there was on the previous one, just due to the fact that the dye is really, really dilute in here. But I think that these colors layering together are beautiful, and I moved it around a few times, again looking for big, empty, white patches. When I speckle, I like to go in and go heavy. Yeah, let's take a closer look.
All right, we've added a lot of color. There's not yet a lot of color on the yarn mop, but we'll have this wiped down, and then there's a lot of extra dye in the cups that we can use as well. There's still about 10 minutes on the timer before I can switch out what is steaming, but got some small speckles. You can see that they're spreading a bit. In part, this could be because it's fluorescent, in part it could be because I've moved it, but soon we'll steam set this for 30 minutes.
Okay, this is our first speckled yarn. And I see some speckles in here, but there's no question that these colors have spread out a lot from what they looked like when we were just on the counter. This is beautiful, and I do see a little bit of speckling, and honestly, putting this down, I think that there might be some powder that wasn't set because I see some spots of color on here. I'm going to set this aside. For contrast, here is the yarn mop that we then wiped on the counter, and you know, this did not have any like sharp speckles on it, and that shows. But we don't really see sharp speckles on the other one, so we'll have to take a closer look once it's dry and less steamy. Our citric acid colorway is now in the steamer basket, and we are going to steam set this one for 30 minutes as well.
Now let's play with this yarn mop and leave no dye behind. And to start, we've got to wipe everything up. I reckon you could do this inside a basin with a lip or something to it, so that way you don't risk stuff running onto the floor, but I do always wipe the floor down, and things tend to stay on the counter pretty well. Okay, what do we want to do here? Yeah, I think I'm just going to add loads of color to this.
I wiped down the counter, and then I started sprinkling on some of this leftover dye powder just to use everything up. And then when I was done, I went to go steam it for 30 minutes, and there was more dye on the counter and more dye in the cups. And well, I was determined to have no leftover citric acid powder, and I just started pouring this onto one more skein of Stroll Fingering weight yarn. And I mean pour. And the way these patches of color went on looked so cool. I took my gloved hands and I patted it down, which spread it through. And this seemed cool, so I flipped it over and I did the other side with the rest. This might be way too much dye. Things might spread out a lot when I go and I steam this, but this was fun. I could not go this heavy onto the skein if it were not mixed with citric acid. That would just be entirely way too much pigment. But this has me thinking for the future, and yeah, I'm excited. Okay, this time we have speckles, and the speckles stayed. The citric acid, and sorry, it is really steamy over here. The citric acid worked really well to create some fine speckles, and now I need to set this. It's still very steamy though. We need to set this aside, and then it can cool so I can wash it. And here is the Swish DK yarn mop that I will wash off camera, and we'll take a closer look at everything once the yarn is dry in the conclusions. Now for our mega yarn mop, that is in here. And as for what's left on the counter, I'm gonna wipe that up. I'm not gonna get another mop for the mops. But you could do that, for sure. Now that the 30 minutes are up, whew, okay, it's steamed. Lots of color in there. I am actually gonna leave the lid on here and leave this one in the steamer basket to cool off. And that is because a little more heat won't hurt this one, and it's very pigmented. So once this is cool, then we'll wash it. What are the odds that this speckled yarn is gonna turn just the water pink as soon as I put it in? Well, we'll see. It is maybe a little pink. It is so pigmented. And there we see some pink. I'm not gonna worry yet because I think that there was some unbound, like when I moved it in, I saw some dye. So I think there was some that just hadn't dissolved yet. Oh, I'm seeing some speckles in there. But the thing that is a little, yeah, you can see from putting it in that there was a little bit of this dye on there. The thing that is concerning is that that liquid was the vinegar soak that we had from the beginning. So we will see. This is stunning. Okay, I might not be seeing bleeding anymore. We'll see. I'm gonna add some dish soap. I don't think I'll show the washing of every single skein, but this and then the yarn mop that is the most concentrated at the end for sure. Alright, I'm still seeing a hint of bleeding, but it isn't bad, and again, I think there was some unbound dye. I'll keep watching this and come back when the water is clear. A few rinses later, and I'm not seeing any more bleeding. I'm now going to probably rinse it one more time for good measure, but then put it through my Nina Soft spin dryer and hang it up to dry. Speckly speckles, let's wash. I am not expecting to see any bleeding at all with this one. These look like, ooh, there's one really pigmented patch there. But that color is staying in the yarn. I'm gonna wash with soap. I'll add our Swish DK yarn mop into the pot and wash them together, and then we'll put them through our spin dryer and also hang them up to dry. It's actually the next morning as I come in to wash the more heavily dyed skein. And part of the reason why everything felt so heavy was because everything was mixed with citric acid, and so that just made everything feel like I was adding way more dye and color, but I'm not seeing any bleeding. And I'm gonna have to tell you that looking at the other yarn that had finished drying, I think we got more speckles than I thought. So I think wet, you can't really appreciate the variation as much as when it's dry. But let's add some soap here. Yeah, no bleeding. I am really, really happy. So I'm gonna rinse out the soap, put this yarn through the spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and we'll come take a look. And I gotta tell you, this has worked way better than I thought. Can you speckle with Dharma fluorescent acid dyes? Yes. Yes, you can. In every single case here today, we got beautiful speckles. Here's the first skein we did directly with the acid dye powder, no citric acid, and our yarn mop that we used to wipe up the counter and everything. And when this came out of the steamer basket, I couldn't really see those speckles. It looked like a lot of spread of color. But now that it's dry, there are speckles all over the place. Yes, there's a lot of purple pop speckles. Those are probably the most obvious because it has that little bit of blue that strikes first. But I do see small specks. It looks like that the neon safety orange also breaks a little bit with a little bit of a yellow halo. And I feel speckles in there. And I think there's pinks like, yeah, there's some fluorescent fuchsia speckles in there as well. There's more speckles in the yarn mop than I anticipated, but I think it is all stunning. So right now, I would say the one thing that really doesn't work for speckling with fluorescent dyes is low immersion, because if it takes a little bit more time for the colors to strike, having less water in your yarn, so having it damp on the countertop, makes it harder for the dye to spread through the yarn, and you can get sharper speckles. But speaking of sharper speckles, we next mixed our 3 fluorescent colors with some citric acid. I didn't measure out the acid dye, but I took a similar small scoop, probably, oh gosh, maybe around, if I'm estimating, around 1/8 of a teaspoon. I'm not positive, but I used about a tablespoon of the citric acid powder in each case. And so having so much more citric acid than dye meant that we were easily able to get these dispersed fine speckles on the yarn. And I would still call this base white. I think that we have these super, super fine speckles. And again, the situation where if we were low immersion, I think we would see more spread here. But because it was on the countertop and then steamed, we were able to get these teeny, teeny pricks of bright neon colors. And even going heavier on our yarn mop, we see a lot of speckling. There were areas where I thought it was going to feel super muddy, but you still see a lot of distinct colored speckles. Finally, I didn't want to leave any of the powder behind, and we went heavy on one last yarn mop. And this is incredible. I literally poured the citric acid mixture on the yarn and patted it in to try to soak up and use up as much as possible. And we've got patches of color and speckles, and I wonder if I can do this intentionally, or if I would add way too much color, or if I would put too much thought into it. But I want to do this again so badly. I wonder if the fact that these colors spread, so like they break, you get the speckles, and then you can get a spread, it gives us a reason why we have both speckles and then more of a wash of color in here. But things could have turned really muddy in here, and they didn't. You feel yellow, which wasn't a color we had selected, but you still feel yellow, purple, pink, and orange in here. And it's stunning. And I think that this on the countertop, man, and then steamed, it could be so good. It could have gone really bad though. It was definitely really possible here to add way too much dye, and then you would have tons and tons of bleeding. But I think any of the bleeding that we saw today was the result of having a little bit of powder that hadn't dissolved yet, so that needed to be rinsed out. So again, I need to play with these colors more. The one downside of this technique is that I always get a lot more nervous when I'm doing heavy things with powder on the countertop, especially as we got more towards these yarn mops over here. I just worry about flinging the powder onto the floor. But I did wipe the floor, and there was no pigment to be found there. I always sort of mop up the floor after I'm doing anything with powders, and there is a chance that it could have been spilled. So that is a good thing. But if I was going to scale this up, maybe I would want to do it outside. I don't know. Shauna Jones, thank you so much for sponsoring this episode of Dyepot Weekly. I am so excited because I think I've mentioned a few times recently that I wasn't sure if this was possible. And it's possible. It's very possible. Shauna, I really hope that you are going to love your yarn. It was hard for me to pick a favorite, but this first one worked so well, and I didn't think it had worked at all, that I think this is the one I'm going to send you. If you're curious what's going to happen to the remaining 4 skeins, you should go over and check out the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. I'm not sure if these particular 4 skeins are still available in the shop, but my shop is filled with hundreds of skeins of yarn that I feature in my videos, and so when you're looking at the yarn, you can always go learn more about exactly how it was created, because I include the video title and the date or approximate date that the video was published in the item description on Etsy. You can find my link in the video description and in the top right hand corner of your screen. I've seen other dyers with neon speckles, so I knew that there was a possibility. But I also know with as many skeins of yarn that I have dyed personally, I am not at the level of some people who will dye hundreds of skeins in a single colorway. The technique required to reproducibly create those colors on such a large scale is something that I'm not currently capable of. And now, that's not just, I'm not trying to put myself down. There are tools and things I don't have access to. Like I can have on the stove probably a max, I guess if I was to cram my steam pans full, of 8 skeins at a time. So there's many reasons why I don't dye hundreds in a colorway. But doing tiny batches also allows me to play around with the different techniques in a different way. And so I think that there's just fun in all of it, whether your goal is to scale up and do wholesale or shows, or if you want to do small batches and play with color. Whichever way you decide to go as a dyer, if you're starting a business, I think there's space for everyone in this community. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and if you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel, what are you waiting for? Please subscribe and then press that little bell icon to have your notifications turned on, so that way YouTube can let you know each time I release a new video or start a live stream. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook if you want to get some other notice of when things are going to happen. I occasionally post on my Instagram stories, sometimes not with a ton of notice, but I will often announce live streams in my stories, and so it is worth checking out. You can find the links to all my social media and everywhere else you can find me all down in the video description. Actually, there's tons of useful information in the video description. I also often include timestamps for different points along the video, and you can find links and affiliate links to the different materials that I use throughout the video. So if you want to try to recreate one of my colorways on your own, that's a helpful place to start looking. Shauna, thank you again for sponsoring this episode of Dyepot Weekly, and to all of you, thank you so much for watching.